Another thing is that, again, we perfectly understand that if Kadyrov Sr., well, not the eldest, who has long since passed away, but this middle one, Ramzan, kicks the bucket, then accordingly, in any case, things will not be simple in the Republic. And the Kremlin, none at all. Adam, firstly, legally, it's impossible to appoint Adam. He hasn't reached the required age at which he can become the head of Chechnya. But of course, the Kremlin doesn't want to appoint him under any circumstances either. And perhaps let's put it this way. The possible assassination attempt is actually a kind of warning, not to try to twist our arms, because it won't work out for you anyway.
So you believe that the Kadyrov clan can no longer handle a power struggle in Chechnya, and in the end, the bigger predators will devour them?
I think so. I think the Kadyrov clan won't be able to win the war. Furthermore, there are specific individuals whom the Kremlin is significantly more likely to support and back, such influential people in Chechnya in a rather serious struggle for power. Because if that weren't the case, what happened to Kadyrov Jr. wouldn't have happened. This, of course, shows us that the intensity of the power struggle in Chechnya is already extremely high.
If we could only discover the exact location of the hidden mechanism or trigger, now that has been specifically aimed directly at Kadyrov, because, as you say, he has many enemies. And with the last one, that Wildberry scandal comes to mind. Back then, Kadyrov was a bit more energetic, let's put it that way. That was about 1.5 years ago. And remember, he declared a blood feud against a senator from Dagestan, if I recall correctly, Kerimov, and 2 State Duma deputies. If this is their move, their game, do you think it was sanctioned by Putin? What I mean is, could the situation in the Caucasus have reached a point where these internal wars are no longer overseen or able to be stopped by Moscow?
But still, it seems like Moscow, at the very least, could have been aware of it. Because if Moscow really had no idea, there wouldn't have been such an information blackout. They might have blocked it in Chechnya, but it would have leaked out from Moscow. On the other hand, there's also an interesting point worth noting. Apparently, they didn't allow Adam himself to be taken to the Emirates, even though the plane was already prepared, and accordingly, they wanted to take him there specifically. But they forced him to be brought to Moscow. At that time, again, as in Chechnya today in Grozny, the level of medicine is such that it's not even necessary to take someone to Moscow. Right now, the medical care in Grozny is even better than in Moscow. Yet for some reason, they insisted on taking him specifically to Moscow. Accordingly, Kadyrov himself is also not being allowed to leave Russia at the moment. And they're also forcing him to stay here. Another interesting point, which also indicates the high level of confrontation. According to rumors, Ahmad has been allowed to fully withdraw to Chechnya. I don't know how much this is actually confirmed on the front line, but they say that Ahmad has now returned to Chechnya, which also suggests that apparently there is something inside the Republic that needs to be confronted. And you said it correctly, of course, this high level of confrontation within Chechnya itself will intensify the situation and the tensions with Dagestan and Ingushetia, which are already high.
What do you think is a peaceful transfer of power even possible? Your prediction? What will happen to Chechnya if tomorrow they decide to declare him already deceased? Ramzan Kadyrov and possibly his son Adam as well, I think they are being kept in Russia so that a cushion can be placed at the right moment. You know, once someone is approved, they'll just put a pillow over their face and they won't leave their rooms. Well, what do we consider?
Peaceful, yes, in my opinion, if indeed. If someone fired an RPG at Kadyrov, that would already be a truly incredible story. Another matter is whether it will come to such a civil war within Chechnya itself. It might not happen. And in fact, it's no coincidence that Akhmat was recalled. Let's not forget that Akhmat itself is not so much led by Kadyrov, who is in an unclear condition, but rather by the same Apti Alodinov. Therefore, everything will depend on whose side the security forces within Chechnya itself are on, and whether there will be an internal power struggle, or whether they will all more or less conditionally obey the Kremlin. And in fact, that's why, in my opinion, the Kremlin's appointee is most likely to be Abdelodinov, who, on the one hand, is a security official, and on the other hand, is quite loyal to the Kremlin. And accordingly, if the main thieves do not object to this, then perhaps there won't be much bloodshed. Well, as for minor bloodshed, of course, there will be a bit of that, because in any case, they'll have to purge the government of the numerous offspring of the Kadyrov clan. And
are there clans there that would want to spill a lot of blood who would not accept it? For example, Alaudinov? That's possible too, isn't it? They've already realized perfectly well that Kremlin appointees sooner or later lose their minds, becoming intoxicated with their own power, and it's unlikely they want this regime to continue.
Well, it depends on how well Abdi Alaudinov himself can come to an agreement with everyone else. And by and large, maybe everyone will be satisfied at the first stage with just some bloodshed, the Kadyrov clan, which of course is a thorn in everyone's side as well. And maybe such an agreement between Moscow and Chechnya might satisfy many people today.
All right, but let's also hope for some external forces that are eyeing the Caucasus. Could they take advantage of this? Well, take Turkey, for example. Why not? Look at how they've managed things with Azerbaijan. By taking it under its wing, Putin doesn't even meddle there anymore, to put it bluntly. He doesn't interfere there anymore, to put it bluntly. These are some possible scenarios. Do you think that's possible? Could someone from the outside set off centrifugal processes there?
It's possible, but in my opinion, not today, maybe a bit later. That is, this flywheel needs to pick up some momentum first. It's no coincidence that Kadyrov himself spent so much time in the Emirates. He tried to establish as many connections as possible with the monarchies of the Middle East. So we'll see whose influence in Chechnya turns out to be the strongest. And again, I'll repeat, it's no accident that they don't want to let them leave and are keeping them in Russia now. Apparently, they want to minimize any external influence as much as possible.
Maybe. And in general, to probably wrap up this topic about Ramzan Kadyrov, whether he's dead or not, we still don't know. Maybe his body's already being embalmed, so to speak, or kept in a refrigerator. Also, looking back at Soviet practices, this was done quite often, even with the leaders of the Communist Party, while they were searching for a successor. I'm puzzled by another question. How can someone reach 49 years old with such a state of health? Don't you think that maybe the Russian special services had a hand in this too? Maybe even without Putin's consent. Maybe someone gave him some tea with polonium, for example, or handed him some Novichok to sniff.
Yeah, it's possible, maybe even without Putin's consent. I believe that the main poisoner in Russia today is precisely Putin. If we look at the history of eliminating those people who knew Putin well from St. Petersburg, we'll see that poisons were involved. That's the most preferred weapon. In other words, poisons are exactly Putin's favorite weapon. So if there really is something going on with Kadyrov's health, and it's not just by chance, then it's quite possible that Putin himself at some point decided that he no longer needed Kadyrov in the way he was trying to position himself. Because we've always spent a lot of time focusing on Kadyrov. Everyone was saying, what if Kadyrov comes after Putin? But in fact, Putin himself was not at all pleased to hear talk about Kadyrov possibly succeeding him. That's why it's better if after Putin, Kadyrov is already
not around at all?
Yes. So it would be better if Kadyrov didn't exist at all. Although from the point of view, from what I know about Kadyrov's own condition, he is still alive for now and in fact not as bad off as he could be given his situation. Still, yes, he is on constant dialysis. But we all remember how long Andropov lived on constant dialysis, even though back then it was a much more complicated process. That is, Kadyrov cannot live without dialysis, that's true. But on dialysis, he is still somehow managing to exist. So for now, he's not in the fridge yet.